The roar of the fire was a familiar symphony to Captain Thomas Rodriguez, a 34-year-old battalion chief at Station 9 in Phoenix, Arizona. He was accustomed to danger, to making split-second decisions that determined life or death. But the danger he faced now wasn't external. It was the slow, suffocating kind that settled into the corners of his immaculate desert home. A danger cloaked in silk and expensive perfumes. Thomas was a hero to his city, but increasingly he felt like a stranger to his own 2 children. Since the death of his first wife 4 years ago and his subsequent engagement to Maria, Davis, a stunning 31-year-old financial analyst, the atmosphere in the modern sprawling house had shifted from one of warmth to one of brittle, regulated silence. He had convinced himself that Maria, with her sharp organizational skills and undeniable charm, was the stability his family needed. After all, she presented a perfect facade to the world and to his colleagues, always polished and seemingly devoted. Yet, a creeping, cold intuition gnawed at him, a feeling that something essential was being sacrificed. Thomas's 11-year-old son, Brandon, a boy who once talked endlessly about space and baseball, now spent hours retreated into the minimal decor of his room, his shoulders hunched with a quiet resignation that cut Thomas to the core. Amy, his 7-year-old daughter, who used to greet him at the door with a fierce hug, now offered only a cautious, sidelong glance. Their laughter, once the vibrant echo of the house's life, had faded to rare, muffled sounds. One Tuesday afternoon, after a grueling 48-hour shift, Thomas found Amy quietly tending to a wilting houseplant in the spacious, sun-drenched atrium. When he knelt beside her, she whispered, "The rules are different when you're on duty. Daddy, they're much colder." The ambiguity of the phrase struck him like a punch. He pressed her for details, but she simply shook her head, fear flickering in her eyes. It was a single, cryptic spark. But for a man whose profession was built on identifying the source of an invisible heat, it was inevitable. Thomas knew he had to find the truth, not through interrogation, which would only scare his children further, but through observation. He realized the mask he wore as a successful firefighter was blinding him. He needed a different kind of disguise. He spent the next 2 weeks meticulously setting up his plan. Using a discreet contact in his department, he arranged for an extended, confidential medical leave, citing accumulated stress, a cover story that would satisfy his superiors in Maria. He then contacted an old friend who specialized in landscaping maintenance for high-end properties. Thomas, a man who rarely wore anything but his uniform or custom-fitted suits, bought several sets of worn, ill-fitting civilian clothes, a wide-brimmed straw hat, and sunglasses that completely obscured his distinctive blue eyes. He shaved his neatly trimmed beard into a messy stubble and adopted the name Edward, a recently hired assistant to the regular gardener. The change was remarkable. A high-ranking city official had vanished, replaced by a weary, anonymous laborer. The plan felt extreme, even insane, but the possibility of his children being unhappy in their own home was a torment he could unendure. His first day disguised as Edward, the air in the luxurious gated community felt different. The security gate that usually opened with a polite nod now scrutinized his battered pickup truck. When he arrived at his own driveway, his heart hammered against his ribs. The house, his castle, felt distant, imposing. The regular cleaning staff, unfamiliar with his face, directed him to the back where the landscaping work began. It was there he met Catherine Campbell, the family's new 30-year-old housekeeper. Catherine was immediately notable. She wore a simple uniform, but her dark eyes held a profound depth, and her presence was quiet yet strong. She was 7 months pregnant, moving with a careful, deliberate grace that spoke of underlying strength, not frailty. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but steady, placing a cooler of water bottles near his work area. "Mrs. Davis requires the west side rose bushes pruned first. Don't touch the orchid greenhouse. She handles that herself, Tom." Keeping his gaze down, and his voice deliberately hoarse, mumbled, "Understood. Thank you, ma'am." He began working under the blistering Arizona sun, the physical labor grounding him in his new reality. The difference between handling a fire hose and handling gardening shears was vast, yet both required patience and precision. The pain in his back and the sweat stinging his eyes were nothing compared to the emotional discomfort of watching his own life unfold without him. He quickly realized the truth of Amy's whispered warning. Maria, who was always sweetly affectionate when Thomas was around, ruled the household with a glacial, hypercritical precision. Every cushion was to be perfectly plumped. Every chore finished exactly on schedule, and the children were expected to be seen but not heard, especially when she was on a video conference or entertaining her friends. He saw her snap at Brandon for leaving a single textbook on the kitchen island, not with a raised voice, but with a frigid look and a low, terrifying pronouncement. Discipline is the only language children truly understand, Brandon. You will learn it. Brandon, whose face was already pale, simply nodded, grabbed the book, and vanished. It was during these moments that Catherine emerged as a silent counterforce. While Maria was busy, Catherine would subtly intervene. She'd sneak Brandon a peanut butter sandwich that wasn't on the regimented meal plan, or she'd take Amy aside and teach her how to fold. Origami cranes her hands, moving with gentle, practiced care, turning a moment of tension into one of quiet creativity. Thomas watched, hidden behind the dense shade of a mesquite tree he was trimming, as Catherine knelt by Amy, her large, pregnant belly resting on her thighs, and whispered something that made the little girl smile, a genuine, unburdened smile that Thomas hadn't seen in months. One sweltering afternoon, Thomas was laying new mulch when he heard a muffled argument from the back patio. Maria was scolding Catherine. You used expansive Italian soap on the service counter. I specifically told you that's for my guest bath. Are you incapable of following simple instructions, or are you just wasting my resources, Miss Campbell? Catherine's response was respectful, but not certain. I apologize, Mrs. Davis. The cleaning caddy was misplaced. I used what was immediately available to finish the job on time. Maria's scoffed excuses are for the Remember your place, Catherine. You're here to serve, not to think. Thomas's shears paused mid. He had to clench his jaw so tightly that his teeth ached. He was watching his fiancée humiliate a vulnerable, pregnant woman, and he could do nothing but pretend to be Edward, the lowly gardener. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the chirping of cicadas and the dull thud of Thomas's beating heart. The emotional fire he was fighting now was far more complex than any structure. Fire it was a deep, burning betrayal fueled by his own negligence. He wrote a single phrase in his small, worn notebook that night, hidden away in the cheap motel room he was renting. The true worth of a home is measured by the silence it keeps. Thomas realized his physical strength was useless here. He needed evidence, a way to dismantle the impeccable facade that Maria had built around their lives. He continued his work, observing the small, daily acts of cruelty and kindness. He watched Catherine shield the children from Maria's scorn, using her presence as a buffer, and saw the children flock to her like moths to a lamp. He understood that his initial fear that he had simply been too busy was a flimsy justification. He hadn't been too busy. He had been willfully blind, seduced by the promise of easy stability. He was living a lie, and the cost was his children's innocence. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, a fitting backdrop for the turmoil inside the house. He packed his tools, his hands blistered and tired, but his resolve harder than ever. He had seen enough to confirm the worst. Now, he needed proof to end it. The next morning, Thomas arrived early. The cool desert air, a brief He saw Catherine sitting alone on the patio, running her hand over her swollen abdomen, a look of deep weariness on her face. She was the calm center of a toxic storm. His time was running out. He had only a few days left before his medical leave ended. He knew the next move had to be decisive. The weeks that followed Thomas's decision to gather definitive evidence were a slow, agonizing grind. Working under the fierce glare of the midday sun as Edward, he felt the weight of his disguise pressed down on him. Not just physically, but morally. He was an observer, a ghost in his own life, forced to watch the injustices inflicted on his children and the compassionate woman who risked her security to protect them. Every day was a lesson in the subtle terror that permeated the house. Maria didn't need to yell. Her disapproval was a palpable, icy atmosphere that suffocated any spontaneity. Brandon and Amy had learned to anticipate her moods, walking on invisible eggshells, their childhood resilience replaced by a practiced caution. Thomas noticed the meticulous ways Maria controlled their resources. The high-quality groceries Thomas ordered for the family often sat untouched, while the children were served bland, processed meals that Maria claimed were necessary for strict calorie management. One morning, while Thomas was ostensibly weeding the ornamental succulents near the breakfast nook, he saw Amy trying to hide a half-eaten plum slice in her pocket. Maria, with the sharp eyes of a hawk, spotted the movement. "What is that, Amy?" Sweets are only 4 weekends. Spit it out. It wasn't an absolute, it was a plum, a piece of fruit. The humiliation on Amy's small face was absolute. She looked down, her lower lip trembling, and silently placed the plum on her plate. Thomas felt a desperate urge to tear off his hat, reveal himself, and shout. Instead, he gripped the trowel until his knuckles turned white, whispering the word Edward to remind himself of the part he was playing. He understood then that Maria wasn't simply rigid. She was deliberately using control and deprivation as tools of emotional abuse, slowly eroding the spirit of his children. Catherine, meanwhile, became the quiet hero of the household. Her advanced pregnancy did nothing to diminish her spirit. In fact, it seemed to amplify her protective instincts. She'd covertly leave small, nutrient-rich snacks, a handful of almonds, a cup of fresh yogurt, or a piece of fruit in the children's designated play area, always ensuring Maria was preoccupied. She didn't lecture. She simply provided nourishment and comfort. Thomas saw this daily dedication, this selfless risk, and realized that Catherine's worth surpassed any professional qualification. She was acting out of pure maternal instinct, extending her care to the 2 vulnerable children in her charge while simultaneously preparing for the arrival of her own. One afternoon, a significant turning point occurred. Thomas had installed a microscopic audio recorder, a piece of equipment salvaged from his firefighting gear, and a seldom-used ventilation duct near the kitchen. He was pruning a large bougainvillea nearby when he heard Maria's voice, sharp and dismissive, aimed at Brandon. Brandon, doing his homework, had asked Maria for help with the difficult physics problem, a topic she openly prided herself on mastering. Honestly, Brandon, 4 attempts and you still don't grasp the concept. You have your father's lack of focus, not his ambition, she snapped. Go figure it out yourself. I am preparing for my conference call. The sting of the insult was twofold, directed at his son's intelligence and a direct, calculated attack on Thomas's own professional background. Brandon's nipple was audible, followed by the soft, quick sound of Catherine's approaching footsteps. Brandon, would you mind helping me move these cleaning supplies? Catherine's voice was a soothing balm. Once they were out of earshot, Thomas heard Catherine talking to him gently in the hallway, recorded clearly by the device. Your dad is a captain, Brandon. He saves lives. That takes enormous focus. You're smart. You just need a different explanation. Let's look up a video on your tablet later, okay? She wasn't just comforting him. She was subtly countering Maria's psychological manipulation by reinforcing Brandon's self-worth and honoring Thomas, the father. This, Thomas realized, was invaluable. He had the proof of Maria's insidious verbal cruelty, combined with Catherine's unwavering, tender support. The recording was gold. However, the escalation reached a critical point when Maria began to perceive Catherine as a threat. The children's increasing attachment to the housekeeper was becoming obvious, undermining Maria's brittle authority. She started making Catherine's life incredibly difficult. She would assign heavy tasks, knowing Catherine was heavily pregnant, like moving large boxes of winter decor from the attic in the suffocating Arizona heat. One morning, Thomas, disguised as Edward, was hauling bags of yard waste when he saw Catherine struggling to lift a 20-pound box of linens. He instinctively dropped his bag and moved towards her. "Let me take that, ma'am," he said, using the formal address. Catherine looked up, surprised, a bead of sweat tracing a path down her temple. "Oh, thank you." "Edward, Mrs. Davis insists they be moved immediately." As Thomas effortlessly lifted the box, Maria materialized at the top of the sweeping staircase, her face contorted in an expression of pure, cold fury. "Edward, you are here to work the yard," she hissed, her voice cutting through the air like thin glass. "And Catherine, you are dismissed from the remainder of your tasks for being unnecessarily distracting. Go to your room. I want to see you packing your non-essential belongings immediately. Your services are being ... reevaluated." The threat was clear. Catherine, alone and pregnant, was about to be fired without cause, purely for accepting help and maintaining the children's affection. Thomas's blood ran cold. The thought of Catherine being thrown out, of the children losing their only shield, was unbearable. He realized he could wait no longer for the perfect moment. The moment was now. He had enough evidence, and the emotional danger to Catherine and his children was at its peak. The decision to act surged through him with the force of an oncoming train. He knew the chaos his reveal would cause, but he also knew the alternative was a slow, spiritual death for his family. He went back to the yard, his hands trembling as he shoved his tools into the truck. He had to prepare for the inevitable confrontation, which he knew must be public and undeniable to completely destroy Maria's carefully constructed image. That evening, back in his solitary motel room, Thomas listened to the recording one last time. Maria's chilling indifference, Brendan's quiet misery, and Catherine's gentle, firm voice offering hope and guidance. The sounds were a testament to the fact that heroism was always about rushing into a burning building. Sometimes, it was about providing a quiet sanctuary from the flames of emotional neglect. Thomas removed his gardener's hat and sunglasses, looked at his tired, unfamiliar reflection, and made a promise to the man he saw. Tomorrow, he would be Captain Thomas Rodriguez again, and he would save his family from this domestic fire. The following morning felt charged with a volatile energy. Thomas, having the rough clothes of Edward for a crisp Nutrisuta uniform of authority distinct from his fire gear, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He arrived at his own house, not through the service entrance, but through the imposing mahogany front door, using the key that identified him as the owner, not the hired help. The sound of the lock turning reverberated through the quiet foyer. He was early, catching the household during a typical mid-morning routine. Maria was hosting an impromptu brunch for 3 of her closest, most influential friends, all wives of powerful city figures. They were seated on the terrace, sipping expensive sparkling water, their conversation a carefully curated blend of gossip and professional praise. Thomas walked onto the terrace, the contrast between his formal attire and the lingering scent of soil and sweat from the past weeks serving as his own dramatic statement. The conversation abruptly ceased. Maria, perfectly poised in a silk shift, stared at him, her smile freezing mid-sip. Thomas. What in the world? You're supposed to be in recovery. I thought you had 2 more weeks of leave. Her tone held a mixture of genuine shock and icy proprietary offense. The recovery process was faster than anticipated. Maria, Thomas stated, his voice calm, steady, and dangerously low. Or perhaps he paused, letting his gaze sweep over the carefully arranged tableau of false perfection. I simply realized that the crisis I needed to address wasn't physical, but right here, in my own home. His friends looked nervously at one another. Achi, that moment, Brandon and Amy appeared from the living room, drawn by the sound of their father's unexpected voice. Seeing him standing there, not in his uniform, but in his civilian authority, they hesitated. Amy took a small, protective step backward, demonstrating the deep-seated fear she had learned. "Children, go back to your studies," Maria commanded sharply, attempting to reassert control. "Your father and I need to discuss this situation." "No," Thomas contradicted, placing a hand on Amy's small, shaken shoulder. "They will stay. They are the reason for this discussion." He then looked past Maria, towards the entrance to the kitchen where Catherine stood, her face pale but her chin held high, ready to face the consequences of her impending dismissal. "Catherine, please join us." Catherine stepped forward slowly, her heavy pregnancy making her movements deliberate. Thomas looked directly at Maria, his blue eyes hard as flint. "Maria, I haven't been on medical leave. I've been Edward the gardener." The declaration landed with the force of an explosion. Maria's mouth dropped open. Her friends gasped, scattering nervous looks. "The gardener? That's insane. Why would you humiliate yourself like that?" Maria demanded, her composure finally fracturing, allowing a raw edge of panic to surface. "I needed to see what happened when the mask came off," Thomas countered. "I needed to see the truth you worked so hard to conceal. I needed to see how you treated my children and how you treated the people who serve us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small recorder. The action was simple, yet devastating. "I've heard everything, Maria. The subtle criticisms, the psychological manipulation, the food restrictions, the calculated efforts to diminish their self-worth, and the threats made against those who tried to help them." He pressed play. The recording filled the terrace, the sound of Brandon Eschok's request for help with his physics homework, followed by Maria's cold, cutting voice. "You have your father's lack of focus, not his ambition. Go figure it out yourself." Then the soft, firm reassurance of Catherine's voice, immediately followed by the sound of Maria berating her for a misplaced cleaning caddy and threatening her livelihood. The atmosphere of the terrace was instantly poisoned, turning the bright, sunny space into a chamber of truth. Maria's friends, embarrassed and horrified, began to rise, murmuring apologies. "Stop that ridiculous theater," Maria shrieked, making a desperate lunge toward the recorder. Thomas blocked her move easily. "The theater is over, Mariah. This is reality." He pointed toward Catherine, who stood silently. "A picture of dignity and endurance. You wanted to fire this woman today because she showed my children kindness and because she accepted help while carrying her own child. You failed to realize that Catherine is the only person who brought light back into this house, acting with more moral character in the last 2 weeks than you have shown in the past 4 years." He turned to his children. Kneeling down to their level, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears of remorse and relief. "Brandon Amizad is so sorry. I was blind. That ends now. You are safe." Brandon, who had been stiff with fear, finally broke, rushing into his father's arms. Amy followed, bearing her face in his shoulder. The embrace was fierce and restorative, an instant healing of months of neglect. Thomas rose, the gravity of his decision clear in his voice. "Maria, this is over. Your engagement is terminated. You have exactly 1 hour to pack and leave this property. Any further contact with my children or Catherine will be met with immediate legal action. You chose to value control over compassion, and that choice has cost you everything." Maria, defeated, pale, and exposed, sputtered an attempt at denial, claiming she was only enforcing discipline and trying to manage the house. But her excuses fell flat against the undeniable truth of the recording and the protective sight of Thomas holding his children. Her friends left swiftly, avoiding eye contact, the perfect image of her life dissolving into public shame. When Maria's hasty departure was sealed by the slam of the front door, a profound silence descended upon the house. It wasn't the cold, stifling silence that had reigned before. It was a peaceful, exhausted quiet, the stillness after a great storm has passed. Thomas turned to Catherine, who was subtly wiping a tear from her eye. "Catherine," he said, moving toward her, "you are not only not fired, but I am doubling your salary. You saved my children. You are a hero. When your baby arrives, you will have a full year of paid leave, and when you return, you will have a permanent, protected place here as a valued member of our family." Catherine, visibly moved, shook her head gently. "Thank you, Captain Rodriguez. I only did what any mother would." "And that," Catherine, Thomas replied, "is exactly what I needed." True bravery isn't always about facing fire, but about choosing kindness when it's dangerous to do so. The ultimate lesson Thomas took from his time as Edward was that the highest walls are often built from denial and superficial desires. His wealth and status had blinded him to the simplest, most powerful human truths. He learned that the true foundation of his home wasn't the luxurious structure, but the simple, unselfish love embodied by a pregnant woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. The home was no longer defined by its flawless facade, but by the warmth radiating from the small, imperfect family rebuilding its trust in one another, now shielded by the strength and compassion they had. The sun continued to shine on the terrace, but now the light felt cleansing, ushering in a new, honest beginning. If you appreciated witnessing Thomas's emotional journey of overcoming denial and finding true heroism in the most unexpected place, we warmly invite you to join our community. Subscribe for more stories that explore the depth of human emotion, the struggle against injustice, and the promise of a new start. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching these stories from? Share your city so we can connect with our global family. And finally, did you like the video? And what is the biggest lesson you took from Thomas's time disguised as Edward?